First, I'd like to say a very large thank you to the Rachel Carson Center, all of the welcoming staff who put me in my office, set us up today. Thanks so much for Christoph for all the help and support along the way. And thank you very much, Helmut, for that kind introduction. Especially the mention of certain unfortunate episodes in my past, which give a nice segue, of course, to the question which I'll be taking up today, which is the question of evil. In environmental history, we're not going to go through Braunau, though, to get to the answers, but rather through the history of Soviet whaling. So, Soviet whaling and the problem of evil in environmental history. And I'll start by admitting that there is no clear solution to the problem that I'm going to be talking about, or at least none that I've been able to find. Perhaps in the question and answer session you can give me those answers. The problem that I'm referring to is one which has dogged this project of mine since the very beginning. It is the problem of evil. I start here with two pictures which show something of what I at least find to be the evil in this story. The first is a group of Soviet whalers and various support crew who've taken the unborn fetus of I think a fin whale or a blue whale in this case, and are posing for photographs with it. They've killed its mother, extracted the fetus. In the other photograph, there are two whalers who are nursing from a killed mother whale as well. Whales which, by the way, were not supposed to be killed. Nursing mothers were supposed to be exempt from killing in the Antarctic and elsewhere. These are two photographs which I've puzzled over, which haunt me and continue to haunt me as I try to write this history. But I do think there's something not just gruesome about this, but something useful about considering the problem of evil. And for this reason, I'm going to argue today that a look at the horrible history of Soviet whaling offers both an opportunity to confront one of the worst environmental crimes and shocking stories of the 20th century, also to probe the limits of evil as a way to analyze history in environmental history. And the answers, as I've been able to find them, come through the difficult relationship between humans and the ocean, the problem and opportunities offered in particularly by labor history, and also whaling books for children. All right, so let me start with the facts. In 1947, the Soviet Union signed the International Whaling Convention, which set up a commission designed to regulate global whaling and to some way conserve what was already clear were going to be dwindling whale stocks. From 1948 to at least 1972, the Soviet Union systematically falsified the reports it sent to this commission in order to cover up what was a massive campaign of illegal whaling, conducted in full knowledge that it was nearly causing the extinction of various large whales. As scientists have reconstructed over the last several decades, the USSR secretly killed almost 180,000, mostly highly endangered whales. These are figures just from the Antarctic and the North Pacific. There were additional ones. As you can see, the numbers were particularly egregious around humpback whales. They said they'd killed just under 3,000. They'd actually killed 48,000. This is a huge amount of illegal, excess, and falsified whaling. In the process, they played the most important role in nearly bringing several species of whales to extinction and forever changing the ecology of the world's oceans. It was the closest thing to genocide that we can observe in humans' relationship with large mammals. It was also, in the words of one biologist, the largest removal of biomass in global history. It was also, in my opinion, evil. And this opinion is one of the reasons that I started this project. Hundreds of thousands of whales have been slaughtered, many of them in secret, all of them cruelly. Someone needed to tell the story fully, to grapple with the evil that lies at the heart of it, that produced it. But of course, in the course of researching, digging deeper into this history, these questions begin to seem murkier and murkier. Perhaps most difficultly for me, I ended up meeting a large number of these ex-whalers. For example, just a year ago, I traveled to Odessa, which was the capital of the Soviet whaling industry, now lies in the Ukraine. There, a group of ex-whalers, you can see them in the picture here, they met me at the airport, they conducted me around the city, they set me down for a long talk about what whaling had meant to me. They shared with me the poetry that they'd written about being in the Antarctic, gave me pictures of penguins, icebergs, told me what turned out to be, in their retelling, a very beautiful story of success on a personal and professional level as part of the whaling industry. I liked these people. They were generous. They were gracious. They were eloquent. And this started provoking really difficult feelings in myself. Here I was trying to understand the very evil that lay at the heart of this history. When I met the people who had conducted it, who had perpetrated it, it was very hard for me to see where the evil lay. I couldn't help but thinking of the fate, for example, of ex-Nazis, people who had been exiled, imprisoned, in some cases executed for their crimes. Here were these ex-whalers living out their golden years, not in shame, not in hiding, but in open, basking in the memory of what they've done. I'm not going to pursue that comparison too fully, but others have. For example, in the 1970s, the founder of Greenpeace, Bob Hunter, who was protesting Soviet whaling off the coast of California, compared these whalers to carnivorous Nazis, as he put it, in pursuit of armless Buddhas, the whales, of course, to really bring out what he considered the deep evil that was involved in modern whaling, and especially Soviet whaling. And it's not as if, by the way, these Soviet whalers didn't know what they were doing. While I was in the meeting with them, suddenly this man stood up, interrupted the conversation. I hadn't known it, but Yuri Mikhailov, one of the scientists involved in uncovering the falsification, was at this meeting, and without any hesitation, he got up and said, "Everything you're hearing is nonsense. What we did in the Soviet Union was amoral. It was a massive crime. I repeatedly spoke up against it and warned people what was going on." This is what he was saying to me and those around the table who had actually committed these crimes. What stunned me was the reaction of these ex-whalers. Instead of being offended, instead of feeling shame, they were excited to have this world-renowned biologist in their midst. They had all sorts of questions about whales that they wanted to ask. Why did whales strand? Why did some of them jump in the air? All these questions that they'd wanted to ask for years, they finally could ask this biologist. They didn't seem ashamed at all at what they had done. In fact, what it revealed to me is they actually were intrigued, entranced by these creatures which they had killed in record numbers. How could I reconcile what I was viewing with my impression of the deep evil that lay in this history? Now, perhaps I find it difficult to reconcile these, what seem to me to be irreconcilable histories, because of my profession as an environmental historian. Environmental history got its start as a field trying to uncover the modern evils that have caused the ruin of the global environment. Now, many of us, of course, have moved more or less beyond this question. We're asking much more sophisticated questions about environmental history. But I think this obsession with right and wrong, with evil, still remains closely under the surface. And personally, I would not like to abandon an unsparing quest to uncover evil in humans' relationship with the environment. But of course, structural factors were at work in Soviet whaling as well. This is not just a story of individuals. Indeed, the history of oceans presents a classic study in humans' inability to rationally and successfully manage their relationships with non-humans. If Garrett Hardin invented the notion of the tragedy of commons for the land, probably its best expression has come in the oceans. The collapse of codfish stock, for example, was something which caught people unawares in the 80s and 90s, despite best attempts to try to head this off. Oceans are hard to understand and even harder to regulate. The IWC, the International Whaling Commission itself, was a flawed body which had all sorts of problems in stopping whaling. To what degree then was the Soviet experience any different from that of other countries on the ocean? Well, to understand this history, we'll now plunge into a relatively foreign and strange moral universe. And I'll start with what to me was a very strange fact, that the Soviets considered whaling to be a great subject for books for kids. Children's books on whaling appeared in the 1920s, but in large numbers in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s. I'm going to take a look at just one of these books, this one right here, which is called Kit na linya, or Whale on the Line, by Grigoriev, Mr. Grigoriev, who had sailed to the Antarctic, came back, wrote a book for the children of the Soviet Union. You can see some of the contents inside. A very helpful cartoon explaining where the different products of whaling went. That's fat and meal from whale fat sledding down into the Soviet economy, as well as other sorts of meal from the different parts of the whale. This is a picture of whalers posing inside the jaws of a blue whale. You can see the penguin taking the photograph here. Soviet children's literature in general was awash with environmentalist messages. This was one of the key ways the Soviet Union got across its environmental values. In the 1930s, for example, one book put it, "Man is subordinating the forces of nature to himself. This will be a mighty blow to age-old darkness and religious prejudices." This was a fairly blunt statement of how the Soviet Union should approach the natural world. But of course, this arrogance, as we see it now, of subordinating the natural world, we can locate as one of the key problems of humans' relationship with the natural world, especially in the 20th century. But by the 1960s, when this book appeared, Soviet literature toned down its most aggressive statements of conquest. Instead, it celebrated what it now considered to be more or less a fait accompli. An industrial Soviet Union which now could rationally and completely subordinate nature, including whales. And this made for some kind of weird literature. Kit na linya, for example, did take up some of the classic stories you might expect to find in a whaling book. Aggressive sperm whales coming up and attacking Soviet whale ships, the kind of Moby Dick style of literature. These stories were present, and despite the smiling whale you saw on the cover, whales were often depicted as quite vicious creatures. Soviets really hated killer whales. Killer whales were said to be more cruel and violent than sharks here. But surprisingly, other whales actually come out quite positively in the book. For example, the book related that Soviet whalers, in their study of whale behavior, had noticed that humpbacks in particular were very altruistic animals. Altruism was very important for the Soviet Union in looking at the natural world. It helped provide some support for the idea that humans might subordinate their own interests for others. And humpback whales seem to offer some kind of a model here. While other whales, when one of their friends was harpooned, they fled from the scene. Humpbacks gathered around, trying to figure out what was wrong with their wounded comrade, as they put it. They scurry around the injured one as if asking him what had happened. And when the weakening whale begins to drown, they put their flukes around him and try to save the dying creature by bringing him to the top of the water. So how do you make sense of these interesting, even altruistic whales put next to their industrial slaughter. Well, Kitna Linya came to, seems to me, an odd conclusion for a children's whaling book. Whaling was basically boring these days. True, sperm whales hadn't changed, they were still vicious, but because of the high technology, the modern fleet that the Soviet Union had created, they didn't pose any more threat to the whalers. It was just as easy as going out, finding them, harpooning them, bringing them up the slipway into the industrial process. No more Moby Dicks. Whales had become part of a large machine. So what was the point of a children's book emphasizing this regularity of whaling? Well, one perhaps surprising point to me was that conservation was not only important, but actually possible. This is what Kitna Linya claimed. If whaling had become regular, it was also regulated. This message had some strange manifestations, certainly from a Western point of view. For example, the book dwelt on this man, Afanasy Purgin, a harpooner, a hero of socialist labor, and perhaps an arch conservationist as well. As they put it, Purgin killed with artistry. He was a great artist in his profession, but he also knew that for many years whaling had been done in an unsustainable manner by predatory foreign whalers. He knows, it said, many species of whales had nearly disappeared due to their irrational extirpation. Therefore, Purgin was very careful only to kill male whales, the largest, carefully selected, each one through his great skill, not to violate the International Whaling Commission. And elsewhere, Kitna Linya warned about the threat of total extinction, which is why Soviet whalers rigidly kept to all international standards. Thus, there can be no doubt that the Soviets were well aware of the terrible impact they were having on whales, very aware of the need for conservation. And there's no doubt that Soviet children were reading total lies. In fact, had it not been for Soviet cheating in the late 1960s, the IWC was actually on its way to forming some kind of workable strategy for conserving whale stocks. So here again I confront another baffling contradiction at the heart of Soviet whaling. Affection for whales, virtuous statements about Soviet conservation, all written by someone, Grigoriev in this case, who had seen the falsifications at first hand. There seems to be evil here to me, but where did it come from? Now it's true, of course, Americans also wrote whaling books, so did Australians. This one's a bit more recent. The Whale Hunt, for example, is the story of a boy who decides to go out whaling instead of fishing, but he decides to live capture a sperm whale instead. Brings it back, puts it in his pool. The whale was lonely, but tragedy is averted because he goes out and catches a second sperm whale and puts it in the pool with it, and then the two are friends. Thus ends the happy tale of a boy and a whale. As Ken Norris put it, Ken Norris is the author, not coincidentally, one of the main proponents for orca capture and display, a position that he held. He was a top marine mammal scientist, also to the end, very avid supporter of orca capture. Okay, this makes for strange reading in the 21st century, I'll admit, but it's not the level of outright lies that were taking place in Soviet children's literature at the time. Okay, so how to go about understanding how Soviet whalers themselves dealt with this problem, how they understood it. Well, to take a look, to try to get to the heart of that problem, I looked through what turned out to be a very good source, voluminous source, which were Soviet whalers' memoirs. Many of them wrote down their experiences, and also the onboard newspapers that they kept. This is an example of the latter. These are two newspapers which are actually printed on board Soviet whale ships, that is the Dalny Vostochny Kitaboy, or the Far Eastern Whaler. This is one which talks about celebrating the 60th anniversary of the October Revolution, again from the same newspaper. In the words of Soviet whalers, what became clear to me is that the most important thing for them was not so much the killing of whales, but their relationships with others on board. Or in other words, what they refer to as their collective labor. And as Karl Marx and many others, but especially the environmental historian Richard White, have noted, labor is the intersection between human energy and energy found in the natural world, non-human energy. It is perhaps the most crucial site for environmental history, labor history, even though its importance has gone underappreciated, especially, I think, in American environmental history, which tends to ignore the laborers themselves. White, at least, has mobilized labor history to demonstrate that humans know nature primarily through its transformation, and the workers, consequently, are potentially some of the natural world's best stewards. Here, the nature of Soviet labor becomes important. Workers on board whale ships, as well as in other industries, were organized in what they called collectives. And collectives drew on long-established Russian traditions, especially in hunting, but elsewhere as well, of shared labor. And in the Soviet Union, collectives were exceptionally important, a locus of shared identity, and as a means of increasing production. For example, on board the whale ships, collectives engaged in something that they called socialist competition. Socialist competition was an explicit competitive relationship between one workers' group and another to increase production as much as possible. It was a prominent feature of life on board whale ships. For example, in these newspapers, on a weekly basis, different collectives' production figures would be printed. And you could see where you stood. If your collective was near the top, of course you were singled out for praise. If yours was near the bottom, you were shamed for not meeting your obligations. Sometimes this competition turned ugly. But on the whole, workers embraced it. That's at least my reading, in spirit and in deed. This is at least the way they talked about it themselves and talked about it with the world. For example, one year, after a particularly stormy season in the Antarctic, when whalers from around the world came together in Cape Town in South Africa to reprovision before they headed north, they engaged in discussions with each other, and the Western whalers were shocked at how many whales that the Soviets had managed to catch. This was a terrible season for us. How did you manage to catch all these whales? Do you get paid twice as much for killing whales during storms, they asked him. No, the Soviets said, we don't get paid anything extra. It wasn't entirely true. But nonetheless, no, we don't do it. Then why do you risk your health for doing something so risky and dangerous? Well, Soviet motivations were difficult to explain to these foreigners, but they went to the heart at what it meant to be a socialist laborer. Work was the highest expression of one's commitment to society. Those Western commentators who looked at the Soviet Union and located its problem as an insufficient motivation to work hard, I think got it exactly wrong. In fact, work was everywhere valued in the Soviet Union to an exceptional degree and formed a very crucial part of individuals' identity. Workers' collectives, of course, in theory at least, formed the Soviet state, even if that wasn't always realized in truth, but they did provide forums for constant discussion of workplace culture and socialist commitment. And the reason Soviet whalers risked their health for larger catches may have certainly owed more to cash bonuses than they admitted, but it also was in large part due to their commitment to their collective and the socialist competition they were engaged in. They expressed a genuine feeling of obligation towards the socialist society, the pride that came with making an extraordinary contribution to its success. Being treated like rock stars when they got back to Vladivostok or Odessa certainly didn't hurt either. This may not have been exactly the capitalist work ethic described by Max Weber, but perhaps it was a form of Das Kapital, work ethic, at the very least. Of course, the Soviet Union did operate as a command economy. Production targets came from above. As one Soviet scientist put it, it would not be quite right to blame the whalers for these catches. If they did not catch whales illegally, they wouldn't fulfill the state target plan, which is the reason they came to the Antarctic. And furthermore, their commanders sometimes pushed them in unholy directions. The most notorious of these was this man, Fleet Commander Alexei Solyanik. He told his whalers that they should leave a desert behind them as they moved through the Antarctic. And this they did. To take one example of the way that these various motivations came together, in 1967 was the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, so an exceptionally important year. The state ordered ramped up production in commemoration of this year, not necessarily for any economic reason, but just as a celebration of the October Revolution. There weren't enough legal whales to kill, so the whalers in the Sea of Okhotsk in Siberia turned to the highly endangered bowhead whales. They killed 126 of them. There were probably no more than about 300 left in the world at that time. So one way of reconciling this contradiction I've examined would be to simply blame a coercive state driven by bad economics and a few bad apples, like Solyanik. Perhaps the whalers, like the whales themselves, were caught up in something they couldn't control. But I have to reject this explanation, at least as a full explanation. Nowhere in the memoirs of whalers do I find a sense that their labor was coerced. No hint of oppression. Instead, to this day, they continue to celebrate their experience, as I mentioned. And I think I understand at least part of the reason why. Beyond the bonds of friendship formed at sea, beyond the excitement of foreign travel, these were all definitely important, whaling in the Soviet Union was successful. In a country full of frustrations, substandard consumer goods, inadequate housing, censorship, whaling succeeded. Year after year, kill targets were raised, at least until the 1970s. They were almost inevitably met. From nothing, they built one of the world's largest, most successful whaling fleets. They labored hard, they worked together in their collective, in socialist rivalry, and they did very well. In fact, this labor seems to represent exactly what the Soviet Union had promised its people: well-paid, patriotic, non-alienating labor. There were at least a couple of problems here. First, as Kit na Linia, this children's book, showed, whaling could be boringly mechanical. Workers merely part of this faceless machine that erased their individual effort. And this is the reason that, paradoxically, for an industry which had become regular, the skill of the harpooner, the individual skill in this highly mechanized world, was repeatedly celebrated. People like Purgin, that I showed you earlier. Purgin may have been depicted as an arch conservationist, but his and others' fame rested on their ability to make huge numbers of kills. For example, Soviet whalers invented the practice of whaling at night, of whaling through bad weather, as I described earlier. Newspapers and memoirs were full of examples of record kills. And while, of course, the Soviet state played its role in setting absurd targets, killing in excess was a crucial part of this positive experience of labor, of rescuing the individual's contribution from being subsumed in a faceless, killing machine. In an industry where nature had essentially been subdued, the continuing labor went into the success of excess. Which leads me to the second problem, the last one that I'll discuss. I believe Soviet workers would genuinely have liked to have conserved whales, as Kit na Linia talked about. Both then and now, the whalers I met express admiration for these intelligent, interesting creatures, altruistic at times. But the structure of positive Soviet labor left no space for such considerations to have any kind of consistent application. Instead, indeed, restraint would have undercut the very positive experiences they had laboring for the Soviet whaling industry. Okay, to conclude. Of course, this problem exists for humans in non-socialist societies as well. The rewards given to us when our labor transforms or perhaps disfigures the earth are sweet. In Soviet labor, though, these rewards, I think, were even sweeter, at least in the whaling industry. Labor without capitalist exploitation, satisfying even as it became regularized. Capitalist whaling, which certainly exploited its laborers, also ended when whaling no longer became profitable in the late 60s. And while foreign whalers were going out of business, popular Soviet culture made heroes out of these people, like cosmonauts. None more so than the whaler who had tamed nature and now managed it while increasing the good of society. In the case of Soviet whaling, at least, the evil lay precisely in this good. Thank you.